The 540 is brought to you by StarCityGames.com weekly sale. Go to StarCityGames.com/sale right now and protect what you collect. With select Magic the Gathering supplies 25% off this week only. From now until June 7th at 10:59 a.m. Eastern Time, you can save 25% off on sleeves, deck boxes, playmats, binders, and more. So if you are looking for the perfect time to fit your commander deck or maybe your new cube with a bunch of new sleeves, this is the time to do it. 25% off of select Magic the Gathering supplies now until 10:59 a.m. on June 7th. Go to StarCityGames.com/sale. Protect what you collect. The 540 is also brought to you by Coalesce Apparel and Design. If you want to get the coolest Magic t-shirts and hoodies and stickers, go to coalesceapparel.shop. And if you find something you like, use gift code SCG to save 10% off at checkout. That's coalesceapparel.shop. Nobody made what they wanted, so they made it themselves.
What's up, everybody? Cedric Phillips here, stopping by real quick to let you know about one of Star City Games' newest podcasts, The Receivables, hosted by yours truly, alongside my partner in crime, of course, Patrick Sullivan, where the two of us discuss Magic sets, both past and present, from top to bottom. On every episode of The Receivables, you're going to hear us talk about the facts of a set, the mechanics of a set, the cycles of a set, you know, the boring stuff, before we get into some crazy stories of when we were playing Magic during the times that the set was legal. We've got a ridiculous award show where we give out awards like the Char Rumbler Award for weirdest card in a set, the Oko Thief of Crowns Award for best card in the set, and a whole bunch more, before we finally decide, hey, what card won the set and what letter grade should we give the set? It's a whole lot of fun. We're having a blast recording them. Hopefully you have the opportunity to listen to it and you enjoy it as much as we're enjoying recording them. Where can you find it? StarCityGames.com or wherever else you listen to your podcast. The Receivables every single week here at SCG.
Welcome back, everyone, to the 540. And I don't have a clever intro today, Ryan, because it's just you and I talking about Cube and how we can start putting together a Cube for the first time. And as always, I'm Justin Parnell. You can find me at jparnell1 on Twitter.
And I am Ryan Overturf. You can find me at Ryan Overdrive. And, you know, I respect not forcing it. Doesn't need to be overly clever or in your face. We got some stuff to talk about that I think we can all agree is pretty interesting. So no need to glam it up. It's just good stuff.
Yes. And, you know, last week we covered what I think was probably the most requested thing since we started doing this podcast, which is how do I start building my first cube? So we went into kind of the basis of I'm starting with nothing. How do I get to the point where I have this first iteration of a cube physically in my hands? So going through the thought process of how you want to theoretically design your cube, asking yourself questions along the way, and making sure that you are happy and feel rewarded of that process, and really focusing on making sure you get that very first cube into your hands. Because, you know, like we had said last week, there's so much time that you can spend on building a cube ahead of when you get it, but it really getting to that first landmark moment is when you have the first iteration of your cube in your hand, whether it is maybe your ideal feel and look of that cube, or maybe something that you really know is going to be version 1 of 100, but getting that first version into your hand no matter what. That's kind of what we focused on last week.
Yeah, and kind of the broad strokes advice there was the Miss Frizzle from the Magic School Bus, you know, like put it together, take chances, make mistakes, get messy.
Yes. So today we're going to look at kind of the second step, because, you know, once you have the cube and you've drafted it a couple of times, you start looking at it from a more, I don't know, observant, you want to observe an eye, you want to refine it more. So today we're actually going to be talking about how to select, identify, and develop archetypes within your cube.
And this is a question that I get asked all the time. People get down to, okay, it's pretty commonly worded, how many archetypes do I need in a cube? And some of that is motivated by a lot of the conversation around cube, the way that a lot of cubes are presented. When you get the introduction to a new Magic Online cube, the introductory article that they post on the Wizards website tends to be an archetype breakdown. It tends to be this color pair has this archetype. And so understandably, that's the way a lot of people think about it. But there's more specific and less specific ways to think about archetypes. And I think a lot of people view a broad archetype breakdown as like a step one thing, when realistically you can be more or less involved in that sort of thing when you start out.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's kind of, that's part of the wonderful thing about Cube is this answer. And I don't want to invalidate the entire rest of the podcast in the first 4 minutes, but this answer can really take whatever form you like, whether that is incredibly focused or just incredibly broad and loose. And those experiences are both fine, but they will just be very different experiences. And I think it's important to identify what you want to do so you can have a better understanding of what your cube ultimately is when you sit down to draft it and play it.
Mm-hmm. And one of the comments we got on the YouTube posting for our last episode was somebody asked the question, does every color combination need to have an archetype in your cube? And short answer is no. Longer answer is there are benefits to having solidified archetypes, but it's a question that is worth asking for each color pair. How focused do I need this to be? What's the upside or downside? What cards am I trying to feature? And when it comes down to color pairings, you're talking about gold cards. If you specifically like some card that's not necessarily tied to an archetype, like it's pretty common for cubes to have just like 1 or 2, 3 color cards. And those cards are very commonly just value, just a bunch of abilities stapled together because they're cards that you like. Like not everything needs to be serving the purpose of an archetype, but it's important to be understanding of what you're doing when you put in a card. Like, is this supporting an archetype? Is this a cool card? Does this cool card lend itself to archetypes naturally? That sort of thing.
Yeah. For example, a card like Maelstrom Pulse appears in a lot of cubes. That's certainly not an archetype specific card, but it's just a kind of a general good card, as opposed to something that could appear in the same section like Grizzly Salvage. That generally that is a more archetype specific card because it's not kind of a wide spanning thing that you want to happen or care about happening over the course of every single Magic game, where if you had black and green mana and I said, would you like to trade one of your cards in your hand out for Maelstrom Pulse? Most of the time, the answer is going to be yes. But if you said that with Grizzly Salvage, it's like, well, probably not, unless I'm doing a really specific thing.
Yep, definitely. And a lot of times you do use your gold slots for stuff that is trying to drive an archetype home. You use the example Grizzly Savage. That often goes hand in hand with Spider Spawning, which is a really cool self-mill archetype focus kind of card. But then, like you said, Maelstrom Pulse, that can be a nice spot to just put a good interactive card on rate in your cube.
Mm-hmm. And I think those are equally as important as the archetype specific cards. And we'll get into this a little more later, but those are equally as important because oftentimes you need to have those just generally good cards to make sure that your deck's like fail rate is above board. Because if you're trying, and this is something, I'm talking more as a cube designer rather than a player in a draft, but like basically when developing archetypes, you want to make sure that they're supported successfully. So when your drafters are going for those archetypes, they need to make sure that they're some amount of cards that fit into the color combinations, perhaps, of those archetypes that are more generically good than they are super specific. And Maelstrom Pulse is a good example of that, but there are tons more. There are tons more across all 2 color combinations, and really, independent cards that kind of maybe lean towards an archetype, but are also generically powerful. And there's a ton of those across cubes. And I would say most cubes are made up of the cards that fit into that latter category of kind of generically powerful, but align with an archetype better than some others.
Yeah, we already used the word a lot, but I guess now I think is a good time to take a step back and talk about the kind of range of things we actually mean when we say archetype. Archetype largely is using a phrase or some way to describe your strategy that answers the question, what is my deck trying to accomplish? Mm-hmm. And in constructed Magic, that's very often just the name of decks, Reanimator, blue-white control, that sort of thing. And it can be specific or more broad like that. The macro archetypes tend to be just control, combo, aggro. Combo usually means you're being more specific, especially in the context of cube, but you can literally just say the Azorius deck in my cube is control. That's sufficient for an archetype. But then definitely there's more specific stuff too, like spider spawning we mentioned. Delirium can be an archetype. Madness can be an archetype. So it's really just what you're trying to enable a deck to do. And that can be specific or it can be more generic. Like the Boros in my cube is trying to be aggressive. That's fine. That checks the boxes. That's an archetype. And then from there, you enable the support for that archetype. And then there's also like small package stuff. And we can get into more of that. Like technically putting the card opposition in your cube opens up an opposition archetype.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I guess when I was thinking like single package, I was trying to think of like small 2-card combinations. Like I was thinking more of something like Splinter Twin and Pestermite. Mm-hmm. But I suppose you're right that there are single card archetypes that you need to have for the archetype to be successful. You need to have a singular card and then some amount of support around that card, which can be a variety of things.
Yeah, we can have archetypes where every card in a color is trying to accomplish a goal, and tends to be the easiest way to do that is all of the red cards in your cube are good for aggressive decks. The red X archetype is aggro, but we can get hyper focused too and say, okay, well, some decks are literally opposition decks. That tends to mean that there's other support, Deranged Hermit, other stuff for tokens, your Gaia's Cradles will overlap, but archetype can mean every card. It can mean one card.
Yeah. And like Ryan said, I mean, it's very wide spanning, and I imagine we're going to use the word archetype a lot in this podcast. So kind of having the context of knowing that when we say that, we are not talking about one particular kind of archetype. Sometimes we will be, and we'll try to do our best to identify when that is the case, but it is difficult. It will be difficult for us, and hopefully, we can make it easier for the listener to try to identify what exactly type of archetype and how that is relating to the cube in each of the discussion points that we're talking about.
Yeah, we will do our best. At times on both sides, we'll have to use some context clues, but I'm confident that we will get through this and have a meaningful discussion.
Definitely. So before we go into our first kind of big segment, I do want to ask, or rather pose a question. And that's, why do archetypes matter to have, or do they even matter to have? And it's something that I think when new cube designers kind of get started, archetypes aren't something that they think about. They maybe think about cards that they like, and oftentimes think about those cards in the context of how they interacted with those cards previously. Oftentimes that is in perhaps a different limited environment when they were introduced to those cards, or maybe even a constructed environment they're introduced to those cards. So why do archetypes matter to have? Well, they only do because it's going to help with the cohesion of your cube, and therefore the cohesion of a draft. Because like Ryan was saying, when you are looking for, when you're in a kind of in a drafting environment, and you are even something as simple as, I'm drafting this opposition, what do I want to draft around that to have this synergy going along with each other? They matter in the sense that I feel like if you don't force them, they're going to happen naturally anyway. because you're going to select cards that you like. And unless those cards are all Maelstrom Pulses, chances are you're going to end up with some archetypes naturally. And then once you have developed, or maybe on accident kind of put in a handful of archetypes, maybe in 4 or 5 2-color combinations, then you're going to start to look at the rest of your cube and say, well, how can I make these decks more cohesive, because these 4 or 5 2-color combination decks are significantly more cohesive. And once you start looking at that, and once you realize the ones that you have kind of put in yourself, it's gonna in most cases going to make you want to develop that further, so your cube is more balanced, assuming that the balance is what you are going for.
And the big thing that archetypes accomplish is they drive investment. And they drive 2 kinds of investment. There's personal emotional investment. When you talk about archetypes driving deck names and having a history with decks, Reanimator is something you can say, and people have been playing a long time. They'll have a lot of thoughts and ways that they feel about Reanimator. Same is going to be true for even something as generic as Azorius Control. Humans, now that deck's been around for a few years in Modern, so having the human tribal archetype that makes you feel a certain way, that impacts how you think about the decks and how you enjoy the experience of playing the game. And then within the draft itself, archetype supporting cards tend to make the pick order in the draft more engaging, more dynamic, where when you have a card that is looking to fit into a specific shell, for example, it's talking about humans, Thalia's, oh man, I'm blanking.
Lieutenant,
exactly.
Lieutenant.
Yeah, plus 1/+1 counter on all your humans. That card is going to make you start reading the type line. And so suddenly cards that are human become more interesting to you. And then your cube is less about just trying to take the most powerful card from every pack and mana fixing. And you get a lot more moving parts. And that, for me, is one of the most important ways to increase replayability in a cube.
I also think it's pretty rewarding for the cube designer to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. When you start getting in and you start putting together these little macro, or these little micro combos, like Ryan's talking about, oh, well, as it turns out, I have 37 humans in my cube and 19 of them are in white. So by adding this Thalia's Lieutenant, it makes those cards a little bit better. And now maybe I want to look at 1 or 2 other cards that also go along with that. And that's developing an archetype exactly right there. So, but I think that's a really great start for just talking about this broadly. But now we want to get into a little bit more specific scenarios and thoughts. So I guess, Ryan, do you have anything else kind of from a wide spanning angle to talk about before we move on here?
I think that's a good baseline, good foundation, and we can get into more specific things.
Okay, sounds good. In that case, we're going to take our first break and be back in just a second. Have some extra cards laying around that you want to get rid of? Go to starcitygames.com/sell. It has never been easier to turn your cards into cash, or if you're looking to outfit your cube or commander deck with some new favorites, get a 30% trade-in bonus when you choose store credit. No matter what your collection looks like, we have a method for you. Want to see exactly what every card you have is worth? Check out our buy list. Don't have time for that? Stick it all in a box. Send it to us, and we'll make you an offer with our ship and sell program. Or if you want a more personal touch, make your way to the Star City Game Center in Roanoke, Virginia to sit down with a buyer just like the old days. With the fastest turnaround time in the industry, get an offer in under 4 days when you go to starcitygames.com/sell. Selling has never been easier. All right, so how do you even get to the point after you've built your first cube? You sit down. The first thing you want to do when you build your cube is play it immediately. Yes. You don't want to sit here and listen to us talk about archetypes. You just want to be like, no, I just want to draft this cube, which is absolutely the right response. That's what you should do. And if you've gone and you've waited and you built the first cube for some reason last week, and you're waiting for this episode to come out to play your cube for the first time, just go play it. We'll always be here when you come back. You're going to have a much better time. So now that you're back and you've had this first experience or two in your cube, how do you even start start down this road?
I find that's something that's very beneficial for me. I'm a little less organized about it, but something that a friend of mine did when he put together a cube that I thought was really cool is he made a feedback sheet. And there was a number of questions he would ask, and he would ask you to identify, what archetype did you draft? And some of that might be something that he intended to be in the cube. You might write down something where he goes, and he sees something that he did not plan. And then you say, how good was my deck? How cool was my deck? Differentiating those things, I think, is kind of important, at least personally, for understanding balance and such. And then he kind of asked to identify cards you specifically thought were fun, cards were not fun. And then a question that I really like, two questions, actually. One, what card or cards drove you to try to play this style of deck, this archetype? And then two, what cards did you not see in the draft that may or may not be in the cube, but what cards did you not see that you think would benefit the style of deck that you tried to draft?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's ironically, that is the exact approach almost to the letter that I instituted when creating the 2 SCG Con cubes.
Nice.
And those were actually the last questions that you posed were actually ones that I really focused on, because I've talked about before that there are times when you are drafting that you might not have access to a card, but once you build your deck, you identify a need for a certain card. So when you iterate that over time is when you find, well, maybe I should have this card or a card like this in the cube for people to have access to. But kind of going back to the segment that we're talking about today, but having the openness for people to try to describe what they're drafting or what they think they're drafting or what they maybe had the opportunity to draft without you presenting them a list of options, I think is incredibly helpful, because when you have a multiple choice list, you're going to choose one of those. Not because you have to choose one of the things on the multiple choice list, but it's really hard to tell your brain that there is an answer outside of the ones that you're being given.
Right.
So it's really difficult to do that. So when you have it open and you're just like, tell me what you did, I think you're going to get a lot more. Sometimes it's going to be less descriptive in some places, but it's definitely going to be more honest when getting feedback.
Yep. And this can help you discover archetypes you should be supporting. A big thing that this helps for me is also identifying signals I'm sending for archetypes I'm not trying to support. I have a wall of omens that has a lot of graffiti on it because a friend tried to draft an Azorius control deck in a cube that I was very much trying not to make Azorius boring generic control an archetype. And I was like, well, how did you even end up here? Like he had an 0-4 draft, like his deck was horrible. I was like, why did
0-4?
I was successful in making the deck bad, but I was not successful in stopping people from drafting it. I was like, how did this even happen? He was like, well, I pick one wall of omens, and like in my mind, that card is replacement level in control decks. It was like because I wanted just creatures in graveyard decks that replace themselves, and also for like a blink sub theme. And eventually I just cut wall of omens from the cube, because it's just like, if people just think this is good, then that's just going to trick people.
What was in what else was in that pack?
I don't remember what else was in the pack.
This sounds like a personal problem for your friend, and I'm sorry, whoever this is. If you looked in your heart and you were like, I love blue-white control so much, I'm willing to first pick Wall of Omens in hopes that there is a better card in all of the future packs for that deck, yet there was not one in this one, you have made an error, friend.
I agree with you. However, one player at the table train wrecking impacts the quality of everybody's decks. And so I do follow up on this sort of thing.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I would have, obviously, if it was a friend that I was relatively close with, I would have been like, so what led you down this road?
Why are you so bad?
And continued you down this road after you got to like the fourth pick and you were like, I'm sure those blue-white control cards are lurking somewhere. Maybe none of them were in pack 1, but they're all in pack 2 and pack 3. Anyway, I do agree with him, though. I think, and that's a very good example you gave of Wall of Omens, because the first archetype that I think about is a white based control deck for Wall of Omens. I think tangentially, perhaps Blink, but I would also not expect that card to be in there for Blink alone. I would assume that both of those archetypes were available, and that was kind of a bridge the gap card between the two. I would never first pick it. Well, I don't want to say never, but I imagine in the cube that you probably designed, I don't think that would have been a first pickable card. However, I would have absolutely believed that would have been a blue-white control card.
Yeah, it was actually bridging the gap with an Abzan Carador style deck, but that I would not expect that to be immediately on anybody's radar.
Yeah, I see that. So what did you took out the Wall of Omens? And then where did we go from here?
Just ended up, then the default thing is to tighten up archetypes that exist that are maybe underdrafted. It took me a long time. That cube has a humans tribal theme. It took me a long time to get people on the actually drafting the humans deck train. And some of that was that the deck scored more on the good side of things than the cool side of things. When you get together to play games for fun, you want to do cool things.
Definitely.
At least that's my personal experience. And that's the experience I try to drive. You know, when I write my cube breakdowns on the SCG and when I draft the Moat cubes, obviously I don't want to set all my play points on fire. And I tend to focus on what I think the best decks are. But when I'm playing my cubes, like, I don't have a compelling need to beat my friends. I want to try to do something sweet. And if I win, that's great. It's preferred that I win, but in general, I want to do cool things. So then over time, I try to find cards that fit the themes that are underdrafted, that maybe offer more for what people maybe want to do, or at least what people think is cool. The humans deck tended to be pushed more. I started doing more sacrifice aristocrat style stuff. And the big card that actually got people excited about drafting a white human tribal deck was Rally the Ancestors. Just like a card that loudly says, you can build a deck around this card.
Okay. Sounds like that probably also played into your little Carador theme too.
Yeah. There's a lot of stuff you can do with Rally in that cube.
Yeah. So that's so something you said of things that maybe archetypes that seemed not developed as much as you might have thought they were going into a draft. But that's something that I often try to look for when looking at archetypes that maybe are underdeveloped, or what cards do I think should be drafted that are just not getting drafted or just not getting played. Usually it's, obviously when we say drafted, it's not like they're not being drafted because if they're in the pack, they're going to be drafted at some point. But the rate of making someone's deck when it was in the cube, and if I see those cards multiple times when they're not on the tables, not in people's decks, that sounds an alarm in my head. And I'm like, maybe I need to evaluate this a little more. Either maybe it's not clear. Maybe it's not clear that this is an archetype, or maybe there's just not enough from a card standpoint. Like there's not physically enough cards to support this archetype, or everyone is assuming that the power level is low enough to where it's not worth their time to explore this in a draft.
And that segues really well into a point that I want to make. An archetype in that cube that failed just badly, and there's some very good reasons for it. I actually learned a lot trying to implement that. So I have humans have worked out, humans have persevered. I tried spirits initially, and the problem with the spirit stack was that the spirit specific cards were not powerful enough or interesting enough to make you want to draft a spirit stack. The powerful stuff you lean into tends to be stuff like Drogskull Captain, a spirit lord that gives the other spirits hexproof. That card is good if all your creatures are spirits, but it's a 3-mana 2/2. It's not a good card. You're not excited to draft that card, even though there's some payoffs. There's other better stuff to copy with a Phantasmal Image. And then when you get into the B tier of spirits, or I think I would actually make the point that the best spirit was Selfless Spirit. And that posed a different problem. A card that in theory could get you excited about a tribe. Well, Selfless Spirit's just a good card to put in your creature deck.
So if I'm drafting humans and you're drafting spirits, I'm going to snap that selfless spirit up as fast as I can.
Definitely. And that's two things to watch out for. Is your flagship actually good and or exciting? And are your role players going to find their way to this strategy? Because if the answer is no to one or both of those, that deck's just not going to show up.
Yeah. It's really tough. That first question is posed being really tough because let's say you are trying to, I think spirits is a wonderful example, like the exact example you posed, but how do you make spirits a thing without having their generically good cards appear in other decks? And that's not like a, that's not a question specifically for Ryan, but just across a lot of archetypes. Like how do you do that? And that's really, really tough. Sometimes you have to bend over backwards to make the support that you're trying to push like very ubiquitous through the draft, but then you also end up with the danger of, well, did I just try to oversaturate this and it still not make it good? Mm-hmm. And then the good cards just got drafted anyway. Did Selfless Spirit just is always going to get drafted because it's just a great card? And that's very dangerous because you're always going to have those cards. Almost every archetype is going to have a card like Selfless Spirit. It happens to be a great card, but it also is, I don't want to say a linchpin, but also like an important factor of the archetype that you're trying to create.
And a little bit of that is desirable. Actually, probably a good amount of it is desirable. You want to make sure that cards can find their way into different decks because that makes it so more different stuff shows up every time you draft because cards show up in different combinations. But you need to make sure there's enough of it to go around. And that was the big problem with spirits.
Yeah. And, I feel like that if you go away from that too much, if you avoid all of the selfless spirits, which are good cards, but not the best cards in the cube, and you're avoiding that kind of like middle tier of cards out of fear of not being able to develop archetypes, you're gonna probably end up with the archetypes that you want. Like you could certainly make a spirits deck without Selfless Spirit, I'm trying to think of another good spirit card, like Spell Queller, without like Spell Queller and Selfless Spirit. But you're going to do that across your entire cube, because then if you're like, this is the blue-white color combination archetype, but I didn't include what are 2 or 3 of the best cards, you got to make sure that you're doing that across the rest of your cube, because then what's going to happen is you're just going to have people not draft spirits, even if it's available. If you've excluded those cards in fear of them getting sniped up out of other things, which is just going to naturally happen, you have to, it kind of sends you in a different journey of either depowering your cube or making it hyper focused on archetypes where there are less bridging the gap cards, which is, I think, something that most cubes are made of. Mm-hmm.
And I have a point I want to get to on hyper focus. Keep the spirits in mind. I have a what's the word? A larger section of one of my cubes had to get scrapped for similar reasons. A more extreme example that we'll get into later in the podcast, but keep the spirits in mind when we get to that later.
Okay, I definitely will. So another way that I always like to look at kind of letting archetypes develop organically is, when you're drafting in the first few drafts, how is that meeting your expectations of what you expected? The answer to that question, whether it does or doesn't, is fine. Both of the answers are fine, and everything in between. And this is exactly what I thought was going to happen. This is not at all what I thought was going to happen. But understanding kind of where you started and then where you ended up, I think is actually a really important thing to pay attention to, because that's going to help inform you when you are trying to change archetypes in the future. Mm-hmm. Because this is not going to be a one-time thing. When you go through your cube and you're making let's just say we'll keep it easy. Let's say you're trying to make 10 2-color archetype for every color pair. And you're doing that today. This will not nearly be the last time that you are making changes or instituting a new archetype in your cube, unless you simply make your cube and you just don't change it. And I think that's pretty unrealistic for anyone that owns a cube. So knowing what your expectations are versus what reality is, every time that you make a change and test it, keep that in mind. The more that you keep that in mind, the better you're going to be at having a realistic expectation of the impact that your changes are going to make on the environment of your cube. And again, the answer to the question, no matter how wide that gap is, doesn't really matter, but it's going to be more work for you the wider the gap is. So as long as you keep going back to the well and keep changing stuff, which again, as a cube designer, that's probably going to happen. This is going to be a consistent thing that you're going to have to evaluate.
And to go back to the question that was commented last week, do I need to have an archetype in every color combination? As a starting point, I would absolutely say no. I do believe that you should trend towards yes. And sometimes you just put in some cards because they're cool or fit one theme, and they end up being a good baseline for a different theme, and then somebody else just discovers it by drafting. In Spooky Cube, I have that Humans Tribal, and I'm trying to think of like spooky Gruul cards or a thing I can do. Like Gruul is actually kind of a problem in most cubes. There's not a lot of powerful or engaging options. And like Huntmaster of the Fells is a human, so I went there. And I ended up with a decent clip of flash creatures and instant speed removal spells and stuff like Blossoming Defense that just fit other things. And I did a draft one night, and my friend was like, I really like this Gruul Werewolves deck. And I was like, what the hell are you talking about?
It's always great.
Looked at his deck, and like he had Mayor of Averbook and the Huntmaster, and I was like, oh, this is really sick. I'm gonna put in some more green creatures with flash and some more stuff you can do on your opponent's turn. This is actually really cool.
How did that work out? Like, did you continue to go down that road?
Yeah, that has stayed as Gruul's identity pretty convincingly.
Nice. So when I was going back to prepare for our last week's episode, I went back and looked at an article that I had written like a decade ago on developing I think it was because I was rebuilding my cube from the ground up. And I specifically remember in that article, I went over 14 archetypes that I had put into the cube, most of which were 2-color combinations. And I had a list of all the 2-color combinations. And I got to green, white, and it just said I had put not supported. Just got to use power and toughness. That's the archetype.
Oh, that is nice.
And this is like, at that point, this was not like my first cube that I'd done, but I clearly, when I was building it, I was just like, you know what? I don't have it in me to try to figure out what I'm going to do for this archetype. So I just didn't. So I just left it. So it was 9 2-color combinations and then like 5 other archetypes like spread across the cube. So I just thought that was funny.
Yeah, that's also something that we can borrow from Mengu Cube. The vintage cube in Magic Online tends to be disproportionately balanced towards blue, but Mengu Cube pushed that a little further. And there were just fewer cards of different color combinations. Like if Stomping Ground sucks in your cube or Temple Garden sucks in your cube, you can like maybe just have fewer lands and fewer gold cards in that combination. And that's something you probably need to be pretty explicit about with everybody who drafts their cube. Maybe every time you do draft the cube, just to remind them, because there's some pitfalls with that. But trying to support it when it doesn't work just ends up with some duds in the packs.
Yeah. I like the example of the Mengu Cube versus the Legacy Cube, because it's like willful accepting of like archetype imbalance versus non-willful.
Yeah, the green-white archetype is shitty cards.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, that's so true though, and I think that that's actually a really good. I think Cube is actually it's quite an interesting cube to discuss from like just a design perspective, and we touched on it a little bit when we had talked about it a few episodes ago, but that's definitely one to just like open up in. I was going to say in a spreadsheet, but excuse me, for everyone else, open up on a Cube website like Cube Cobra rather than a spreadsheet, and just look at it and just try to like put like in your mind, like try to put together archetypes. I think that's a interesting thought experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think I'm ready to move on to the next segment, unless you have any other thoughts here, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm good to go.
Great. Well, in that case, we're going to take our next break and be back in just a moment.
Taking a quick break from the podcast to talk to you very quickly about Star City Games Premium and why you should become a Star City Games Premium member. First, me, Cedric Phillips, I'm the online content coordinator for Star City Games. So if you like me and you want to see me keep my job, you should sign up. And if you don't like me, we're not going to talk about that. Okay, let's talk about what you actually get for signing up and paying the $7.99 per month to become a premium member, which is less than the cost of a couple of booster packs, by the way. It's actually, I think, if memory serves, like less than a collector booster, and they got these set boosters and all these different types of boosters now. So look, let's just say for less than a collector booster a month, you receive the following benefits. Are you ready? 5% discount on all Magic the Gathering sealed products, 10% discount on all Magic the Gathering singles, 15% discount on all supplies, which include card sleeves, deck boxes, binders, all that stuff for when real life play gears back up again. You also get some free entry to some SCG Tour Online events if you're digging the SCG Tour Online and want to play in some of those tournaments like our satellites and stuff like that. Couple of freebies out there. But let's not forget the big one, the exclusive access to Star City Games website content from many of Magic the Gathering's top players and fan favorite personalities like myself, like Patrick Sullivan, like Sheldon Menery, like Paulo Vitor Damaderosa, who is way too good at Magic the Gathering, Jerry Thompson, Autumn Burchett, Brian Gottlieb, Todd Anderson, Ari Lax. I'm going to forget somebody here and they're not going to like me for it. Brad Nelson, who's back writing for Star City on a weekly basis. Michael Majors, Dominic Harvey. The list goes on and on and on. That's how I saved myself there for people that I may have forgotten. Ryan Sachs, I didn't forget you. I swear. Ross Merriam, I didn't forget you either. Shaheen, hello. Stop playing bad control decks. Anyway, $7.99 a month. Less than the cost of a collector booster pack. Get awesome content, discounts 5, 10, 15% across the board. Get access to some SCG Tour online events for free as well. Head over to starcitygames.com/join premium for more information. With that, back to the pod.
All right, so we talked about archetypes in general, how to organically discover those. How about actually developing those archetypes once you have figured out what they are or what you want them to be?
It's definitely a lot to go over on that question. And I think that if you're at a starting point where you don't necessarily have your every color combination archetype and you're not sure what to do with some slots, be they you want some more interactive card or just there's some gold slots you're having difficulty filling, I think something that's really good to focus on is making sure that the opposition, the other decks, have engaging ways to interact with the archetypes you're trying to play with. Think about what you would want to be able to do that wouldn't be oppressive against the archetypes you're trying to support. So I really like sacrifice themes and sticky creatures. And so Bloodghast, Gravecrawler, stuff that jumps out of the graveyard is really cool to me. Mm-hmm. I think it's really bad to put Anger of the Gods in the same cube that's trying to push these things, because those games are never good. It's like either the game ended when I cast Anger of the Gods, or you had like some sacrifice outlet set up so you can blow out the Anger of the Gods. And It's way more engaging to have a lot of stuff like magma spray, so you can try to jockey for position, and it's more efficient in the setup where they have like a sacrifice outlet. You're still only spending 1 mana, but it's not wholly backbreaking when they don't have the sacrifice outlet. And just like thinking about what an engaging game with some back and forth looks like, and having some moderately interactive cards for matchups against the archetypes you're trying to support. And then over time, maybe you decide, okay, well, I have these tools and they seem to fit in this style of deck. Or in my feedback from my players, they say, okay, well, I have this stuff. My deck's not really doing anything. I think it would be cool. This is a generic example. You probably would already have this, but like they're drafting Magma Spray and they think, well, it would be cool just to have a Spells Matter deck. You know, I'm looking for Young Pyromancer, that sort of thing.
I think, Ryan, you have identified, in my opinion, what is one of the biggest pitfalls in cube design. And that is, as a cube owner, you need to be the advocate for every deck that people can draft in your cube. And so frequently I hear people that have cubes that are talking about cards and cards I want to add to a cube that's like, oh, it's so good for this and it's really good against this. But why do you want it to be really good against this? Put yourself in the other, like the shoes of the deck that it's really good against. Like if that's going to be an incredibly frustrating experience and a very one note experience, and I think your point of recursive creatures versus Anger of the Gods is a very good one. You need to make sure that you're advocating for that archetype too. One thing that I see cubes do so frequently is make the cube formed to a way that is anti-aggro. Especially in the more modern design era, there are so many cards that are good against aggressive decks because they have lowered the mana cost of impactful creatures and have, you know, more powerful spells that impact the board, because in a 4 of environment in constructed Magic, you have access to 4 Knight of the Ebon Legions and 4 Monastery Swiftspears and the like. But in Cube, you don't have that in most Cube environments. And I'm just going to be talking about Singleton here. But it's very easy to put those singularly powerful cards in that are good against aggro without thinking about how that's going to negatively affect the drafting or the playing of aggressive decks in your cube. And this can extend to any other archetype. So whenever you are looking to add a card or a group of cards or even another archetype itself, say, how is this going to negatively, how is this, if I'm playing this new archetype or this new card against this other established one, how is that game going to go? Am I actively hurting this other archetype or this other deck's ability to function by simply adding these cards? And if the answer is yes, that doesn't mean you don't need to add those, but you need to be more careful to make sure that you're not invalidating something else just by adding a really powerful card, because especially nowadays, it's very easy to do that and crush something else unknowingly.
And to continue to beat a dead horse, this seems like a good spot for our weekly beat on the card Moat. Like, if you hate losing to aggro, the solution doesn't have to be embarrassing people that draft aggressive decks. Like, if you're trimming on aggressive, cheap creatures and you're putting in hateful cards, like, why don't you just take the logical and fun step and just not put Monastery Swiftspear in your cube at all if you hate it so much? Yeah,
exactly. Just look, if you need to just go look in the mirror, if you've ever said, and I want to take a step back from Moat, which is a miserable card. But if you ever thought, it would be a really cool card for control, Timely Reinforcements. You need to evaluate who you are and what your relationship is with the cards in your cube that cost 1 and 2 mana and like to attack, because you probably don't like them as much as you think that you do.
Yes. Yeah. You don't want to approach balance and finding haymakers against decks in your cube the same way you would building a constructed sideboard. Like, your cube should not have cards from your modern sideboard in it, at least not in that very deliberate sense where it's like, how do I beat this deck? It's like, well, you can beat a deck by just having your deck be good. Like, what if you did something proactive and played good games?
Yeah. Which is why, like, I am always, this used to happen frequently with the Magic Online Cube, when it was just the Magic Online Cube, that they would have like Celestial Purge. What are we doing here?
This horrible.
What are we doing? Like,
yeah, you can tactically main deck it because you don't always draw it.
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
It's not a selling point, man.
I mean, like, yeah, I don't know. But like, think about what you were doing when you are adding cards like that. And I think in most cases, people know, if you're thinking to yourself, man, this card is going to be great in X deck because it's going to crush Y deck. Well, you're responsible for Y deck too. Okay, yep. You're still the owner of this cube. It's fine for your drafters to say that because they don't have any control over the cards that are in their packs. You do. So you need to make sure that the people that like to attack with 1 and 2 power creatures or 1 and 2 mana creatures, because I personally do, so I'm always an advocate for aggressive decks, to make sure that those are supported in a way that doesn't just mean their support, but the absence of other support, and I'm putting big air quotes around that other decks might have access to.
This is another spot where the way I write about the digital cubes and the way I think about and work on my cubes are very different.
Yes. Yeah, because you're a drafter versus an owner.
Yeah, and when it comes to the Magic Online Cube, that's the finished product. We are playing it as is. So I think about it, what looks like the best color archetype, what looks like the worst color archetype. When I'm thinking about my cube and working on it, if I have identified a best color and a worst color, I have 2 problems. And I will be working to make the best color a little less powerful and the worst color a little more powerful.
Yeah, when you're a drafter, your goal is to draft the best thing possible, especially in an environment where you're not drafting with your friends, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you're drafting and there's money on the line against strangers, then you just want to draft the best thing and you want to crush everyone. So it's, I would say that you have at minimum 2 problems if you identified a best and a worst color, because if you've gotten that far, that just means you have 2 very easy to identify problems, but you probably have more because once you start adjusting those, you need to make sure that you don't adjust them to having a different answer to the same question. Mm-hmm. Rather than eliminating the question altogether, which is what is the best color and what is the worst color?
Right.
Because that's a very easy thing to do. It's very easy to overcorrect and say, well, blue is the best color, black is the worst color. I want to fix that. And then in the middle of fixing that, green became the de facto best color.
There's a lot of moving parts, to be sure.
And ironically, that's actually happened in real life Magic.
Yes, yeah. You can watch
exact scenario
design over several years.
yeah. So, but that's something that you definitely have to think about. But even so let's talk about move away from the making sure you're not combating your own archetypes in a negative way. But what about taking steps to enhance stuff? Mainly because like we had talked about with spirits, this isn't the part that Ryan wanted to bring back up, but I'm going to use this as an example. He can use an example again later. But how do we want to boost those archetypes up? And a lot of times it might not be cards that are direct, clear-cut answers. So in a lower powered cube, maybe you want some generic tribal focus. Maybe you have a couple of tribal decks. So if you have like generically good tribal cards, maybe something like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of some anthem card.
If you're trying to like gas up tribal decks and you have more than one, there's 2 pretty good things you can do. One of them is you can push yourself in the direction of the archetype from Modern Horizons 1 Limited and do like Changeling Tribal. Mm-hmm. Make it so that your lords are good in this deck that has a bunch of changelings, and having both tribes represented in one deck starts to make strategic sense.
Yeah.
And another thing you can do, like if you can't get there with a big flagship, just force it on volume. If all of the creatures in one color are suddenly spirits, you're kind of priced into it. And if that sucks, you gotta take a step back. That's getting into the other example I want to get to. But if you really want to see an archetype in action, put in so many cards that it has to show up.
Yeah. And you'll find out either way. Because if from a volume standpoint, someone will end up with those cards.
Yeah, and
just
like
naturally.
Maybe they play 24 basic lands and refuse to register any of them, but then you know that nobody wants to do it anyway.
Then you've still learned something.
You will find out one way or the other.
You have ruined that person's day, but your knowledge of your cube is all the better for it.
Exactly.
And sometimes, look, that's got to happen. But what happens? What about if you don't have other people? Because this takes a really long time.
Mm-hmm.
Like, best case scenario, realistically, you have a cube draft night every week. And it has been many, many years since I've had that.
Mm-hmm.
Probably like 6 years since I've had a consistent once a week we're going to cube. And generally it was my cube that we were drafting with. So I would be able to have one cube session, and then I would be thinking about all the changes I would make and be making between now and the next week. But chances are, especially right now, you probably have more time to think about cube than you do playing cube. So how do you balance the testing and the playing? Because what if you make this large scale change? Sometimes that doesn't even appear. Like you might not get the data you're looking for in a single cube session, and then you have to wait another week. And then you might be asking yourself, well, do I want to change out more cards for this other archetype? Or is this other card not working? But how does that affect the first change that I made? And that's a really tough thing. So go ahead, Ryan.
Some of that really goes back to one of the big questions you asked last week. Are you okay with a gradual progression towards your goal?
Yep.
And everything you just said, those are reasons why if you're trying something really novel, you need to be okay with that.
Yes, you absolutely do. And that's going to be part of the process. You know, you have to, unless you're building this cube for you to play with yourself in isolation, which I guess you could do if you're super into like playing Magic against yourself. But otherwise, if you're in the 99% of people where that's not the case, you are going to have to work with interacting with a group of 3 or 5 or 7 other people that want to have fun and enjoy the cube. And that's what you want too, because that's your ultimate goal. But your tertiary goal is, I want to be making improvements to my cube, and I'm looking at X, Y, and Z colors or decks or archetypes to see how they do. And it is just going to be a really long process. And this is actually something that, because I pretty much draft exclusively in person, like during COVID, I haven't updated my personal cube. And I still haven't done it because I haven't had a chance to draft it. I took it out a couple of weeks ago. I was able to draft. We ended up, someone bought a box of Strixhaven. They wanted to draft that. So we ended up drafting that. I did a 2-person grid draft with someone from my non-updated cube. But that's like the only Magic cards I've had my hands on in a cube perspective in the last year and a half. So it's tough. And the situation I outlined earlier with having a singular cube night a week and being able to take that information and iterate on it, that's for a lot of people a best case scenario. And certainly for me, that would be a best case scenario at this point.
Mm-hmm. And a couple things on that front. When it comes to iterating my cubes, like one advantage I have is I'm a lot better at playing Magic and visualizing game states than a lot of people. Like, I've played Magic at very high levels. I have built successful constructed decks, and those are skills that translate pretty well into visualizing decks on paper competing against each other. Not everybody's there, and that's fine, and that's cool. And also, kind of an extension of that, I'm really particular about balance in my cubes. Not everyone is remotely as particular as I am. It is fine if a cube is imbalanced if you have fun playing it. That is not a problem. As long as you're having fun, there's actually no problems.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I would say for most people that's the goal, right?
Yes, absolutely. And like, if you got some stuff that doesn't work, as long as people are hanging out and making merry, that is the big goal.
Yeah. And that's gonna suck when someone drafts a bunch of spirits and puts 24 lands in their deck. But sometimes you have to make sacrifices. Ryan said he liked sacrifice decks, and that's another example of one.
A full deck to sacrifice your knight with.
Yeah, exactly. So when do you? Okay, so let's. All right. I think it's time to talk about spirits. When do you kill something that's not working?
Yes. So there's a number of reasons you can do it, and I'm going to go to that more extreme example I alluded to earlier. In the course of working on the Devotion, the monocolor theme cube that I've talked about a couple times on the podcast, I wanted every color to have one thing it was good at, and also I tried to bleed it together so every color pair kind of had some overlap. But black was by far the hardest color. And the thing I wanted to make work, because I love the card Sorin Imperious Bloodlord, is I wanted black to be vampires.
Yeah.
One of the problems is all of the good vampires cost double or triple black. So many of the black cards that are trying to play a mono black deck have that problem. Vampires kind of doubled up on it. And that's somewhat fine as long as the mana is good enough and you can maybe overlap. Like there's some of the changeling tribal stuff. And what actually ended up happening in 2 different drafts, somebody had picked up on drafting a vampire deck, and like it bleeds a little into white and a little into red. So it's kind of like Mardu vampires, and they had some good vampire stuff. Sorin Imperious Bloodlord, arguably the best card in any like 40 or 60 card vampire deck in the history of Magic, showed up in pack 3, and they're like, oh, I'll wheel this. And so they took some other card, and there just has to be enough vampires to like make it compelling that somebody else has some. And in both of those drafts, Sorin just didn't come back around. And so brutal. The best card for their deck, like it ended up in someone else's sideboard both times. They're like, well, I have like 3 or 4 vampires, but like there's no other card for me in this pack. And it's just like, this card is not finding its home, and the deck is being drafted, and it's so deflating both for that drafter and for me. Like you could feel it in the room both times. It was like, this sucks. And that was just too much to take in. Like this really parasitic deck that just was not even realizing its ceiling, despite one player drafting it close to successfully.
Yeah. Well, they just didn't have the opposition for their opposition deck. You just thought it was, you didn't think it was an opposition deck. You thought it was a wider archetype, but it turns out it was not.
No, yeah. It's just those decks, they technically could play some solid games without the Sorin, but just missing on the Sorin was so deflating. And you have to give up your ability to cast a lot of spells if you're trying to play double black on turn 2, triple black on turn 3 or 4.
Yeah. Yeah, because then you're just playing mono black and you're like having like a quarter splash of another color. And that's if you drafted your lands highly, which is difficult because then you're passing your Sorin Imperious Bloodlords and they're not coming back around. So, you're kind of screwed either way.
Whether your decks are just not coming together, all the spirits, or you have a deck that somebody tries to draft and it just kind of comes together but sucks and misses just inexplicably, those are some pretty good reasons to give up on an archetype.
Okay, so for this, I have decided long ago that I will not give up on an archetype until I attempt it myself. Like me personally attempting it. It's like the Thanos moment from at the end of at the end of like Guardians of the Galaxy. It's like, fine, I'll do it myself.
Yep.
That's what I feel like when I'm like, okay, you failed. 2 people have tried to draft this and failed. I'm going to absolutely like force this in my next draft just to see what happens, just to see if this is even possible. And then if I can't do it, then I'm like, okay, fine.
So a real quick note on the, I tried to do that myself, and I started one of these drafts with pack one, pick one, Ghoul Draws Assassin. And this is similar to the Sears problem. Ghoul Draws Assassin is like a level up card that becomes basically tap, destroy target creature.
Pretty reasonable card for people that are playing black.
Really good vampire. And I drafted blue black ninjas because the blue cards were just better. So like it doesn't, you can't justify the double black when just single blue cards are just better.
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah.
And I very much have all the same mind where I try to take matters into my own hand. That was ultimately a big part of how humans became a more respected archetype and tribe. Just I was laying the beatdowns and setting up the human-based sacrifice decks. And another one. This isn't less cutting an archetype, but rather pivoting on an archetype. This is a really specific example, but sometimes you have something where you have kind of an aggressive or a controlling slant, and you realize that it would be better to invert it. I like Madness a lot as a cube archetype, and that's been something from the jump in my Spooky Cube, because I love Drakehaven. 3-mana enchantment. Whenever you cycle or discard a card, you can pay 1 to make a 2/2 flyer. And the problem with the Drakehaven decks is they did the same thing every time, and nobody else wanted the Drakehaven. So there was always a deck that was like, I'm just going to spin my wheels until I find the Haven. Very difficult to interact with because it's an enchantment. And then I'm going to start making 2/2s, block until you don't have anything aggressive anymore. And then I'll turn it around. And the decks played out the same way, where you just wouldn't consider anything aggressive. You were a Drakehaven control deck. The games played out the same way because the card was so repetitive in the way it played. And one day I was like, I love you, but it's time to set you free. And I just leaned way more into the Madness decks needing to be aggressive, and that really heightened the tension in the gameplay and the replayability of the games.
I feel like talking about cards like Drakehaven, because that's a wonderful example. I feel like talking about cards like Drakehaven and identifying those cards and kind of talking through the paces of those is probably like its own episode. Because I actually think there's a significant amount of cards like that. And they're all like this like middling to low power level, but become like absolute monsters, but in like a negative experience way. Mm-hmm. When they show, or not when they show up, but like when the deck is put together successfully. That it's either like doesn't work. Okay, now when it works, it just crushes everything, but it doesn't make it fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a little powerful against other decks, and there was some stuff like Flameblade Adept, 1-mana 1/2 menace. Whenever you discard, it gets +1/+0, and that card was always in the sideboard of the Drakehaven player. And when you remove the card, where invariably that archetype is just about that card or a small number of cards, you really free up the ability to play with a lot more of the support cards.
Yeah, that's a good point. Especially if you're moving, if you ultimately move to Madness, that's you're not quite on the level of like Sorin, but that's like a frustrating thing of I'm trying to build this other like proactive discardy Madness deck, and then this card ended up in the sideboard of a player that doesn't intend to use it in most cases.
Yep.
Yeah, that can be frustrating. And this is why, like we were saying a little bit earlier, this is going to be it's a slow process for developing these, because over how many drafts did that take for you to get to that point? And like in real time, how long was that?
It was certainly months with regular cube nights. And that's another thing where that is not necessarily going to be a problem if you have really sporadic cube nights and you're less invested in the balance of it. Like if you really love Drakehaven and you get together every 3 months and draft a sweet Drakehaven deck, like there's not a problem. Yeah. I'm just really particular.
Yeah. But I think that's a good view to look at, though, because I think most people are wanting their cube to be fun 100% of the time, and like having it be fun 90% of the time. I think for most people that's probably not good enough, and they want to shore up that last 10%. I think that's like the constant battle.
Yeah, that's always my goal, and that is the hardest 10%.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's constantly changing and evolving, because especially now, God, in the year, what is this, 2021?
That's the
when
one.
For the thanks, Ryan. For the last 3 years, in 2018, they printed the most Magic cards they've ever printed. In 2019, they printed the most Magic cards they've ever printed. In 2020, they've printed the most Magic cards they've ever printed. In 2021, unless there's more product announced, it will be slightly less than 2020, but probably not. They're probably going to announce more products. So this is probably going to continue the cycle.
Yeah, it's still a lot, even if it doesn't continue to break the year-over-year record.
Yes. So it's really difficult to keep up with balancing your cube and making these changes, as well as like evaluating all of these new cards.
Yeah, and honestly, like I have really pivoted towards, and this is, arguably just obsessive behavior, but I'm just building more cubes. I'm just building more tubers as I get excited about different things.
Yeah, you're a madman, though. That's
yeah.
I don't think we can suggest that legally for people to do.
Don't be like me.
Okay. Anything else on the development of archetypes?
Yeah, I hit the stories I want to hit. Hopefully there were some good fundamentals in there. I don't have anything else that's immediately coming to mind.
Okay. I'm sure if we think of stuff, we'll add it in the last bit. So anyway, we're going to take our last break and be back in just a minute.
Hello there from Dominario's Judgment, a weekly podcast for Star City Games with me, Dom Harvey.
And me, Ari Lex.
Where we bring you the latest, greatest, and downright weirdest things Modern has to offer.
Want to know what to expect for next weekend's events? We've got you covered.
Do you want deep breakdowns of the hot topics and decks in Modern? We've got you covered.
Just want to make sure you don't miss the latest nonsense before your opponents teach you a lesson about it in the queues? Oh yeah, we have definitely got you covered.
And when Modern Horizons 2 blows the ceiling off this format, as it surely will, we'll be here with you to pick up the pieces.
Find us every week on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Or if you want to head over to StarCityGames.com, we'll be right there alongside all the great content from all your other favorite content producers.
So we've talked about archetypes this whole episode, but we haven't given many examples of archetypes for people to have. So what I kind of want to do before we close out the podcast is kind of just go over some examples of archetypes for lower powered or maybe even common uncommon cubes, just to give an idea of what they would look like, or where to even like think of ideas for archetypes maybe.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I think is the lowest hanging fruit and more useful now than I think it was 5 years ago, Wizards of the Coast does a much better job of developing interesting archetypes in limited for 2-color combinations. And I mean limited like in Strixhaven or in Kaldheim or any sets recently. And I think now it is pretty easy to look at those and say, how can I take this archetype that was a focus of this limited format, and how can I develop this for my cube? So I think those, especially for lower powered cubes, those are often really easy to do. And you can kind of say, well, I'm going to take these, 5 or 6 key cards from this one set. And then how am I going to fit the cards around those? So we were talking about, let me try to think of a good example. We'll say Strixhaven is the most recent. So the payoff for like blue and green is the archetype is like about getting to 8 mana. There's a lot of things, or 8 lands. There's a lot of things you can do when you get to 8 lands. So what cards could you add into your cube that help you get to 8 lands that are still, relatively good cards that aren't quite too narrow? So something like I was gonna say like Courser of Krufix, but that is also a generically good card. But better in the better in it's I think it's just because I saw a time shifted version today, so Courser Kruvix was on my mind.
Yeah, like a good example. This is two generically powerful cards, but one I think you could argue is less powerful and better for this archetype. If you're looking at having Coalition Relic in your cube, just like a historically powerful 3-mana rock, or putting that power in Kadama's Reach, where you accelerate your mana similarly, but you're putting lands on the battlefield, and also it's just in one of those colors. Make your cube about that thing, highlight what you're trying to accomplish. So getting to 8 lands, just anything like Growth Spiral, putting extra lands on the battlefield somehow. And then you can also find some cool tangential things. I mean, obviously, putting 8 lands on the battlefield and just cards that cost 8 mana or better, if you can like kicker or multi-kicker them at 8 mana, are a good way to offer some tangential support.
Yeah. Or like even something like a Hydroid Crisis. That's now Hydroid Crisis is in most cubes is obviously a pretty solid blue-green card, but if you're specifically focused on where that is like the ramp putting lands into play archetype, then that is a good payoff.
Yeah, I was going to say like Ulamog's Crusher, but I guess Mythic Rares are pretty good too.
Look. I don't know how much Hydro. I think it's still like $20.
Yeah,
so you're probably right.
That card is it's got to be in a lot of commander decks, right? It's in so many cubes.
That's a lot of commander decks. Ulamog's I hate Annihilator. We were talking about that. I despise Annihilator.
It's not a fun mechanic.
I absolutely hate it. Like if it is, I think it is my least favorite mechanic in all of Magic.
Ooh.
Which is, I know, bold claim. I absolutely hate it. I cannot, I hate it so much that I like actively don't like Rise of the Eldrazi because it introduced Annihilator. And I just wish that I could undo the existence of that mechanic. It's absolutely not fun. Flavorful, sure. It absolutely gets the feeling across of fighting this gigantic eldritch monster that you have absolutely no hope against, because that's what it feels like in a game of Magic when Annihilator trigger goes on the stack. Congratulations, Wizards. You did your job.
I mean, Eldrazi broadly are just among some of the most deflating play patterns of anything heavily explored in the history of Magic. But anyway, let's get back to the topic at hand.
I don't know. I literally am like blind. I don't even know what we were talking about.
I'm just so mad about Annihilator.
Oh yeah, Ulamog's Crusher. That's right. Oh man. So like going back on Strixhaven, like Black Green was about life gain. There's a lot of little like life gainy cards that you can add to support the generically powerful cards in Strixhaven. So if you wanted to grab again like 5 or 6 of those and then create your black green section about life gain, I think that's something that's pretty easy to do. And you again have the entire history of Magic to work with. Another card, this is the point that I was going to make, a card that can go for both of those archetypes is Courser of Kruvix.
There it is.
Thank you. Which is a nice little bridge between the two, because obviously you care about getting to 8 lands with one, which Courser does really well, and then gaining small chunks of life with one, which is what Courser also does really well. Thank you. I circled back around to the point I was initially trying to make after I lost it for a moment.
And something that you're talking about is just how limited environments as of late have really pushed archetypes. A really easy place to see this and a really easy place to start implementing them in your cube is signpost uncommons. It is very regular that there's some 2-color card that says, this is the punchline, draft this deck. A really good cube example of that. We've seen it in a lot of high power cubes on Magic Online, but I think it's like a low power cube all-star. It's weird that we've seen it in 2 vintage cubes. I think it's more fit for like common uncommon cubes and lower power cubes, but I love Soul Herder. Just a card that blinks a creature every turn, lets you know that you care about enter the battlefield abilities.
Yeah. If you start with the set Dominaria, which is, in my opinion, a top 5 limited format of all time, but that's a discussion for another day. If you start with Dominaria, they have made sure to put the 2-color signpost cards into every set. Mm-hmm. Like going forward, they've put a multicolored, of 2 different colors, uncommon in every single set for every color combination, except for specifically 2 color sets. So like Strixhaven doesn't have there's not like a black red uncommon. There's just more of the colors that are supported, but otherwise,
it's all the enemy color stuff there. And something Strixhaven did really well. Strixhaven actually did it in a way that's more broadly applicable to Cube, but this is something that is present in which was the party set? Ikoria?
That was Zendikar Rising.
Zendikar. It was, Zendikar Rising, but there's just like a theme that is all 5 colors. And there's so many different things that cue on basically Magecraft. There's a lot of stuff that's literally prowess whenever you cast an instant or sorcery. Before that was keyword, and even a little beyond that time just as a power level thing or a flavor thing. And just having stuff across multiple colors that cares about the same thing, that's a really literal one. Like your blue-red deck, it's very common for your blue-red deck to be an instance and sorcery matters type things. And if you just have some of these Magecraft cards that you wouldn't necessarily see in color pairs previously, that's a nice way to get people to look at 3-color decks or see how different elements can combine in different color combinations.
Yeah. One of the cards I actually really like for lower powered cubes, specifically common uncommon, but even like some lower powered, not necessarily common uncommon cubes for the blue red archetypes that spells matters. That was in M21 was Experimental Overload. I think that's just a great example of things that are. It's kind of just like a generically good card because it's 2 blue red. Make an XX weird token where X is the number of instant sorceries in your graveyard, then return one of them to your hand. But going and looking for cards like that, blue white, I think this archetype has been done in a few different limited environments, but like blue white flyers, I think is one that is often fun in Cube as long as you have enough removal for it. For lower powered cubes, because obviously it can be, if all of your cards are flying creatures, that can be almost as equally as frustrating as Moat if you just literally have all unblockable creatures.
Yes. And here's another nice note. It does not have to be the case that different color combinations have different archetypes. It's sometimes actually beneficial to have 2 color combinations just have the same archetype supported. And then you'll start to see it represented in different 2-color subsections or in the 3-color deck. So sometimes I'll just spend time thinking of what does a 3-color deck with these 3 colors look like? Yeah. And really common spot where you see overlap, blue-white control and blue-black control. So you get these different flavors of control, and it's not flashy, but it really works.
Yeah. That was something I did in kind of the micro archetypes in the last iteration of my cube, which was a couple of years ago, between white, black, and red with a sacrifice theme. So it was kind of like a small like Mardu sacrifice theme across all of those colors, but it wasn't the singular focus of any of those 2 color combinations. But you could kind of team those up.
That's really nice. And with sacrifice and also with control, you can have different flavors, and so there's an incentive to be 2-color. It won't just be the case that you want the best cards, but a black-red sacrifice deck and a white-black sacrifice deck often look kind of different.
Yeah, for sure.
You're churning out different kinds of tokens. You're sacrificing for different sorts of value. Like a black sacrifice deck usually cares about maintaining some kind of threat on the battlefield that accrues value over time, where the red sacrifice decks tend to be just way more aggressively slanted, and they're like, all right, well, whatever you block, I'm throwing at you with this goblin bombardment. And so
exactly,
they can show up in different flavors. And even with just the generic control example, your Azorius control deck can have sort of a flash theme, and your Dimir control deck can be like a tap out control deck. And sometimes you'll just be Esper best cards, and sometimes you tap out, sometimes you leave mana up. But there's real incentives to be like the Thoughtseize Haymaker deck or the only act on your opponent's turn deck.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, and I think there's a lot of, you could look at, tons of cubes. And like I said, I really encourage people, especially if this is their first go at it, to go and look at all of those limited archetypes that have been put into just the draft environments, specifically with those 2-color signpost cards. I think is a really great start for this, just to kind of get your feet wet and say, this is interesting. How can I, even if I'm not even using any of these cards, but I can see how this is kind of put together in this set. And that can hopefully lead me to a direction of creating that archetype in my cube with maybe some more powerful cards that this set didn't have access to.
And we're going to be talking your ear off in the coming weeks about Modern Horizons 2, but
we sure are.
There's just a smattering of cards deliberately designed to support existing archetypes, and there's going to be a lot of cube motivation in that set.
Yeah, if you've listened to these two and you're like, I just need one more push to build a cube, I'm going to say this now. I think that Modern Horizons 2 is the most impactful set for cube in the history of Magic. Outside of Alpha. I won't count Alpha.
It's really tough to argue that right now because I'm thinking about a lot of these cards.
Yes. So what an exciting time to be a cube owner, or even just a cube drafter at this point.
Yeah, if you're listening to, if you listen to each of our episodes, and even if you've just listened to this episode from start to finish, I assume you must be very grateful to be living in the golden age of cube design.
Yeah, we sure are. And yeah, I can't. When we're recording this, Modern Horizons 2 isn't even done. We have like 3 more days of previews, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And this set is just outrageous. It's great for cube.
It's
I'm
awesome.
willing to sacrifice. I don't care. I hope this set ruins Modern. It's fine. It could ruin Modern Legacy. It's fine. I'll take all these cards for cube. That's all I care about.
I'm actually excited about a lot of stuff that I don't really expect to even see Modern or Legacy play, which is really cool because the stuff that's really pushed in Runes format doesn't always land in cube. Like I hate Oko in a row. Like it was nice to make good Simic cards, but we aimed a little too high, and there's just way more sweet stuff in Horizons. Too high for too long. Mm-hmm.
Simic got to ride that horse for 2 years.
It was brutal.
2 years where that's the best 2-color combination in every format. That's outrageous. It should never happen. That is way too long.
It was a lot.
Oh my gosh. This started with Hydroid Craces and ended with Euro. And it's got so many tools in between. It was just offensively outrageous. God.
So maybe not the golden age of constructed Magic, but it is for cube.
It is for cube. That's right. You can choose to ignore those cards' existence, like Oko. Wizards has done an okay job undoing their mistake of trying to unprint that card, but
I mean, honestly, that's just the best thing about being a cube player first is I get to dodge all of the new set like drama where people are like, this card's too good, and just like I'm just not gonna play with it.
I've never played with or against Teferi Time Raveler in cube, and I don't think I ever will.
Nice.
Yeah. Miserable experience. Anyway, I think we're done for today. Anything else you want to touch on before we head off?
No, I think that there's some really solid information here, and we were planning, depending how they rolled out, we were maybe going to start talking about Modern Horizons this week. And I will say that a lot of doing this specific episode for me was motivated by that question. Do I need to have an archetype in every color combination? What notes do you have on developing archetypes? And I thought that was just a very good question. So if you have like some broad cube question, something that you're fascinated by, something that you don't really know where to start, that could be a full episode, certainly send those questions our way. And, maybe you'll get this kind of intense focus on your question.
Yeah. And this is a really great time to do it because we're going to be talking for Modern Horizons for the better part of a month. So we will have some time if you give that feedback for us to see it and hopefully implement that in topics that we have going forward, because that was, like Ryan said, a really great one that he had saw that we thought, you know what, this is definitely worthy of its own episode.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, we want to thank everybody for listening as always, and please subscribe to this podcast. You can do so. Subscribe to the 540 on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Stitcher, YouTube, your local podcast app, pretty much everywhere. I would just, if you see a search bar on something, I would just type in the 540 and just see what comes up. See if you can subscribe there as well. Maybe you can't, maybe you can. I don't know.
Well,
either way,
you could find episode 540 of a lot of other podcasts that way. I can tell you that.
How many other podcasts do you think have 540 episodes? I don't think there's that many.
I mean, there's enough.
I think it's like
it's a lot of episodes. Don't get me wrong, but
that's a lot of episodes.
I mean, well, what year do you think podcasting really took off?
That's 10 years. If you're releasing better than 10 years if you're releasing every week.
I think
10 years only gets you to 520.
I think we're going to have another unnerving understanding of the progression of time conversation if we start talking about how many podcasts have been on that.
That's a good call. We don't need to go down that road. Anyway, anywhere you can leave us a review, we always appreciate if you're able to do that. That definitely helps spread the word of the 540 and helps people understand how great of a resource this is. Even if you have to lie to yourself while you're putting the review in, that's okay. You will probably be able to move on from that. But just leave it first. Leave the review first.
You'll bounce back.
And then internalize it later. Anyway, you can find me at jparnell1 on Twitter. And my other podcast, Think Twice MTG, you can search for everywhere you can find the 540. So just type in Think Twice MTG. We talk about magic and pop culture. Most people know me from Commander Versus, which is on YouTube and StarCityGames.com every Wednesday. And I stream twice a week on twitch.tv/jparnell. Ryan, where can people find your stuff?
You can find me at Ryan Overdrive on Twitter. You can find my articles weekly on StarCityGames.com. This week, I'm tackling the definitive top 10 Modern Horizons 2 cards for Cube. So you'll want to check that out. It's going to be...
I will check it out.
That's a big deal. And tend to do breakdowns of the Magic Online cubes as they come out, so you can have that stuff ready to go as those launch. I actually had a really faster than usual turnaround time in terms of any preparation, because they literally just announced the Gabby Spartz LSV Alt Vintage Cube. They announced it like for the first time the day before it went live, and for that reason, I just have no idea when I'm gonna be doing those. But they were ready to go as the cubes launch, and you can find all articles on anything Cube from me at StarCityGames.com, and you can get the updates on those on my Twitter at Ryan Overdrive.
Lovely. That's only slightly quicker than they normally announce stuff. Usually it's like 3 days ahead. So I
get like a week or two with just the name, and I get, Pioneer Cube. I bet that there's cards from Pioneer in there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Magic Online, gonna Magic Online, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're gonna get. Anyway, thank you all for listening to the 540. As always, Modern Horizons 2 massive multi-episode review coming up next time. We'll see you then.